And Julian Bream can be heard on Radio 3 tomorrow morning, talking about Villalobos and the guitar. That's in Music Weekly, on Radio 3 tomorrow morning at 10:30. Now on to The Film Club offers a short season of films by Ingmar Bergman. It's introduced by Derek Malcolm, film critic of The Guardian.
Good evening. Over the next few weeks, we're going to take a journey into the territory of one of the most powerful filmmakers of the post-war era, Ingmar Bergman. And though you might think it likely to be a rocky path over difficult and perhaps forbidding terrain, I think you'll be agreeably surprised at the sheer entertainment value on the way. Bergman is often a severe master, but he's also a marvelous storyteller, capable of light as well as shade, and of humor as well as his much-publicized fascination with the dark side of the human soul. In short, he's by no means the depressing Swedish monster some people avoid at all costs, and you couldn't ask for a better antidote to this view of him than Fanny and Alexander, the family saga which we'll be showing in 4 parts as the first half of our double bills during the month. Fanny and Alexander, which has been successfully shown here in its much shorter cinema version, was announced as Bergman's last major film after a career that has spanned some 40 years. And it's tempting to see it as a glorious summing up of all his work, especially the warmer, intensely human side of it. Each of the other Bergman films we'll be showing, Smiles of a Summer Night, Sawdust and Tinsel, The Seventh Seal and Wild Strawberries, is an acknowledged classic, and I think Fanny and Alexander is pretty high up in the canon too. Certainly critics all over the world welcomed the shorter cinema version, but most of us, when we saw the complete Fanny and Alexander, specially mounted at the Venice Festival, recognized that a great deal had been left out. Simply to get the film down to a reasonable length for the cinema, Bergman had to cut chunks of exposition and some brilliant dialogue scenes. A lot of the humor also went missing, and it's this and the enormous warmth of the whole enterprise that I think will most surprise those who admire Bergman's work without really liking it. Bergman himself said that he never enjoyed making a film more, and that he'd been inspired to make it by a fellow Swedish director who'd once said to him, "You who find life so wonderfully rich and entertaining, why do you make such serious, depressing, black films? Why don't you make films showing how much you enjoy life?" No one watching this first part of Fanny and Alexander could deny that that's precisely what he's done. It is, of course, a serious film too, and often both frightening and moving. But Bergman's marvelous sense of time and place, his feeling for even the least admirable of his characters, makes Fanny and Alexander, on one level, one of the best soap operas I've seen, and on another, the kind of rich and absorbing experience only the best cinema can manage. The story centers on the Ekdals, a well-to-do family in a Swedish provincial town. The year is 1907, and it's Christmas Eve. The family is held together by Helena, a widow who used to be an actress. Her husband had bought up the local theatre years ago, and now it's run by her son, Oscar, not a very good actor. Her other 2 sons are Gustav Adolf, a restaurant owner with an eye for the girls, and Karl, a hard-up professor with an eye on the bottle. Fanny and Alexander are Oscar's children, and their view of life informs much of the proceedings. Bergman, perhaps inevitably, has been identified with Alexander, an imaginative boy going through the torments as well as the joys of growing up. But like most directors, he's picked things here and there from his own experience and left the rest to fiction. Fanny and Alexander is, he says, not so much a chronicle based on fact as a crowded tapestry seen from many angles. But he admits readily that there are bows and references to many of his other films, including the wonderful romantic comedy Smiles of a Summer Night, which follows tonight. So now to the first part of Ingmar Bergman's Fanny and Alexander and the spirit of Christmas past. If after that episode of Fanny and Alexander there's anyone who still thinks Bergman's vision of the world uniquely bleak, our next film, Smiles of a Summer Night, should finally persuade them otherwise. Made in 1955, the film is a superb romantic comedy, attractive enough to have been adapted years later into the Broadway musical A Little Night Music by Stephen Sondheim. I say comedy, but of course that doesn't mean just a bag of laughs, since true comedy has something to say too. Somebody has commented, in fact, that Smiles of a Summer Night is like a meringue with a hard centre, while others have compared it to a Mozart opera. Behind its precise period settings, its sumptuous costumes, and its shining black and white photography, which summon up a vanished world as perfectly as Fanny and Alexander, lies a parable about love and desire that equals Offels's famous La Ronde. But the Swedish temperament is not the French, and there's quite a lot of difference between the two films. Bergman's has a less sentimental edge to it, and more of a feeling of regretful angst. Our inhibitions, it seems to say, consistently prevent us enjoying life to the full, and our so-called sophistication is a further barrier. The 8 main characters of the film, one of the least admirable of them regrettably called Malcolm, resolve themselves into 4 couples in the course of the story, and those couples encompass many facets of sexual and romantic attitudes, from the sublime to the ridiculous. Nowadays, of course, the wheel has turned full circle, and our preoccupation with sexual fidelity has more to do with fear than morality. Fanny and Alexander, in summing up Bergman's art, pays several tributes to the older film, which marked a point in his career when he'd not only reached full maturity as a filmmaker, but also achieved international recognition. A special prize was invented for Smiles of a Summer Night at Cannes. It was for poetic humour. And there's a certain poetic humour in the fact that Bergman learnt of it after picking up a newspaper to read in the loo. He read that a Swedish film had caused a sensation at Cannes and wondered what it could be, since Smiles had received a pasting from certain quarters in Sweden. When he realized it was his film, he couldn't believe his eyes. But it is indeed a marvelous erotic comedy, and pretty modern in tone too, since it's the women who do what they like with the men at practically every turn.